Hello there, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Baseball. Hello there. Grays Harbor has seen a lot of high-class baseball in its day. Time when the Aberdeen put a team onto the field right along with Seattle, Portland, and other larger cities of the Northwest, and moreover kept them there and won pennants with them. But it is doubtful if the Harbor has ever seen more high-class baseball in so short a time as it is seen these days at the Olympic Stadium, as the State Semi-Pro Baseball Congress keeps the diamond hot, with the teams playing from 3 to 5 games a day. Home plate fairly smokes for their activity. So tonight we thought we'd go back a few years and see what we can find in the scrapbook about the history of the game as it is played in Grays Harbor. When did it begin? Who were the first who played the baseball game seriously? What about the famous Black Cats and the old Timberland and other baseball highlights of the 65 years that the Harbor has been shaking the horse hide and the hickory bat? So, when we've had the customary words from our sponsor, we'll be back to tell you about Grays Harbor's baseball story. None of the old-timers can seem to recall who might have taken the first baseball out of his treasure chest and began to toss it around the salt flats of Grays Harbor. They allow that it could have been Gal Maynard or Billy Pearson or Joe Graham. It could have been Lem Babcock or any of the others. But they do remember the first important baseball game the Harbor ever recorded. And of course, it was between Hoquiam and Aberdeen. We told you the story once before, but we'll recall some of the participants in the game and some of the events, because it was the first one ever staged. It happened because the 4th of July was to be observed as a holiday in 1887. It was decided that there would be the main event of such a celebration, and Hoquiam challenged Aberdeen to a baseball game. The challenge was all that was needed, and both sides began to organize their teams. Now, I was never able to locate the Hoquiam lineup for that game, and any of the Aberdeen players were Billy Pearson, the magnificent catcher who caught barehanded and without a mask, and who will never know who to have the ball passed to. He entered the game with one eye covered with a piece of beefsteak as a result of a foul tip absorbed while in practice. Jay Weatherwax was the pitcher and excited fans by throwing a curveball, the first that had ever been seen hereabouts. Cal Maynard, Lime Babcock, and others unrecorded made up the Aberdeen team. They played in Scammond's pasture at Montesano. Virtually the entire population of Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and Cosmopolis made the trip up the river for the game. It was played in Montesano because there was no clear ground short of the ocean beaches in the lower harbor. The teams practiced on sawdust diamonds. The Hoquiam team, about where the 9th Street crosses Simpson Avenue today. The Aberdeen, near what was the later site of the Red Fin Hall. It was in the sawdust typically that baseball had its start in the harbor, and for that matter just about everything else too. And after the first game, as the years began to build up the tradition of sawdust lot games, the harbor began to make baseball serious business. Theatricals were few and far between, and make-your-own-fun problems often bothered the harbor folk, pushed baseball into the limelight as one of the chief forms of amusement for the harbor community. And as the population increased, the quality of the baseball improved. Some of the town's best-known citizens were diamond performers, although the game had not yet approached professional quality that it was some day to obtain. The late Ray Sherwood was one baseball star of the early 1890s. The Bose brothers were usually in any game. L.L. Malley helped to fill out the team, and Sunday baseball during the summer became routine. There were new places to play. Schoolhouses provided a ball ground until the high school was built up there in 1892. But Grays Harbor called Stewart Field came into the first because it was the highest ground that could be reached by boat, and most folks traveled by boat when they had gotten between towns. But baseball, as it's played today, still had a long way to go when the 20th century came over the horizon. There were several events which occurred early in the new century that, while they might not seem directly connected with baseball, nevertheless provided the greatest influence as the sport had yet felt on the harbor. One was Ed Finch and J. Carey's Street Railway Company. It was in 1902 that these two promoters began to plan the streetcar system for the harbor, and shortly after the Aberdeen fire, they began to construct the rail lines that were to link the three cities together. Like true promoters, they wanted to be certain that they had a magnet for drawing the customers onto the streetcars. They located their main car barns at the electric park. There was one in Aberdeen on Market Street, but the main barn was at the park, and they planned a program of development for the park area which would require that the townspeople ride the streetcar for whatever attraction the electric park, as they called it, might feature. The harbor had no pavilion for dancing. One was established at the new midway point. It had no picnic grounds, so one was provided there. And then, as most important feature of the new installation, they built a baseball diamond complete with grandstand and bleachers and corners, the harbor's baseball activity. It provided everyone with a nickel a chance to ride out to the very center of the harbor's recreational activities, and as a promotion, it was aimed straight as an arrow at a good thing. And one good thing, leads to another. Hardly had the promoters of the park finished the grading of the outfield than Aberdeen sportsmen began to organize the town's first professional baseball team. By this time, the harbor was ready for some organized baseball. The Northwest League had been playing for a number of years with Spokane, Tacoma, Seattle, and Vancouver, BC, and now Aberdeen determined to get into the organization. With a fund raised by the Aberdeen businessmen and a committee headed by such athletic stalwarts as Walter McFarland, Sam Bowes, and Jim Fuller, organized baseball came to the harbor. The league was expanded in 1907. A 6-team conference of Spokane, Seattle, Tacoma, Vancouver, Butte, Montana, and Aberdeen was keeping the sport headlines throughout the Northwest. In 1908, with Bob Brown magnifying the Black Cats, they won the Northwest pennant, and by 1909, they were established in the Northwest baseball circles. By that time, the Aberdeen Baseball Association was a harbor institution. Walter McFarland was its president, Sam Bowes the treasurer, and a new man had come to assume the management of the club. Not much was known about him except his name was Clarence H. Rowland, but today he is one of baseball's most famous figures and the president of the Pacific Coast Baseball League. Rowland gathered together one of the harbor's best baseball teams together. In 1904, a group of Hoquiamites promoted the league for the harbor. Fred Lefsky was the watch spring, and Will Campbell gave it staunch backing. For Aberdeen, Ed Jones, Lou Mickley, Al Dean, Bert Lewis, and Art Kreshner were the organizers of the team. It was the 4 teams of the leagues of Aberdeen, Hoquiam, Montesano, and Elma that entered. The Aberdeen team was known as the Pippins. They had a good season, and the harbor's baseball enthusiasm ran high. Such names as Sheldon Lejeune, the great outfielder, Seaver, a former Detroit great, The old streetcars made their round trips to the electric park during those days with record crowds. The fans backed the Cats and took pride in the quality of baseball that Aberdeen turned in. But it was an uphill pull for the promoters compared with the other teams of the leagues. The Black Cats were playing a pretty small house. No support was possible compared to that was received by teams from Seattle, Vancouver, or Portland. And although the Grays Harbor businessmen dug down in their pockets and shelled out for their team, by 1910, they had to drop down to something more in their class. A league was organized composed of Raymond, Chehalis, Montesano, Hoquiam, Tacoma, and Aberdeen. With Hoquiam and Montesano in play, the league drew heavily on the bias of intercity rivalry, and 1910 was a good baseball year. And once again the merchants took heart. Again they were ready to shoot high. And after a couple of years of small-town leagues, the locals answered the call to get back into the Northwest Circuit. Seattle insisted that Aberdeen enter a team in the league, and in 1950 the businessmen subscribed $2,000, while another $500 was put up by the people of Seattle just to have the Harbor team in the league. Victoria was to replace Butte in the 6-team league, and the play began that spring with a fanfare of enthusiasm. But it was short-lived. The Harbor team could not match the play of the other 9. The bigger cities paid higher salaries and had the pick of players. Aberdeen languished in the cellar along with Victoria. Walter Mayles, pitching for Seattle, mowed the Black Cats down in one memorial meeting when he pitched both games, a doubleheader, to win 4-1 and 3-2. On the 1st of August, Aberdeen and Vancouver gave up in disgust. Their players were divided amongst the other teams, and the Black Cats, as big-time baseball leaguers, gave up. Baseball was soon swallowed up with the activities of World War I, and it was not until the lush years of the 1920s that the game came back. Well, we'll pause here for a few words from our sponsor and Dick Crombie. In the early 1920s, baseball came back to Grays Harbor with an organization of timber leagues. It was a 6-team circuit with Aberdeen and Hoquiam both entering teams. Tacoma, Longview, Kelso were also represented, and a 6th team that varied with Shelton, Olympia, and Centralia all trying their luck at one time or another. This time the clubs drew heavily on local talent, and some of the sandlot products of the harbor rose to new heights. For Aberdeen, Al Dean, Mel Ingram, and Fred Teague were standout local products, while Hoquiam proudly boasted Fred Gibbett and Rick Jacobson and others. Some of the importance who came to join the ranks of the local teams became residents of the harbor for many years. Don Grant, Harold Cook, Albert Harper got their roots down pretty deep in Grays Harbor's salty soil, and some like Tom Lukwankovich, the pitcher, and Larry Bentoncourt, a third baseman and outfielder, hung up records for their play. Red Flattery, who played first base for the Black Cat team of the Timber days, went on to become a famous professional football coach, and others became familiar names in the Northwest athletic circles. The Depression ended organized baseball for the harbor. The electric park fell into disuse and abandonment of the streetcars, and without a home the Timber League vanished, and the baseball that the harbor had once enjoyed, nonetheless spectacular, has a lackluster of league play and the solid backing of the citizens that made the history when the harbor was young. For baseball was not only an important feature in Grays Harbor of yesterday, it was an absolute essential, and such we have briefly sketched its story tonight in our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.